Hi everyone, welcome to First Chapter Friday. Our book this week is called Running Out of Time, and it is by Margaret Peterson Haddix. And it's kind of a mystery. If you look at the cover, you'll notice kind of the two outfits that she has on. That'll give you a little bit of a hint. They did make a movie out of this, but I think it was called something other than Running Out of Time. I'll have to look into that. All right, so here's our first chapter, chapter 1. The light woke Jessie. Though it was just a glimmer downstairs, she eased out of bed, being careful not to disturb her sister Hannah. "Ma," Jessie whispered by the ladder down from the loft. In a few moments, her mother's tired face appeared below, illuminated by a flickering candle. So here's a little hint. Look at their lifestyle. It should feel somewhat colonial. Hint, hint. "It's the Bentons," she said. "Caleb says both Sally and Betsy are sick." Everybody called Jessie's mother the midwife, but she did a lot more than deliver babies. In Clifton, anyone who got sick at night called on her. Most people, Jessie thought, seemed to wait until dark to get sick, so they wouldn't have to go to Dr. Pfister. Dr. Pfister always gave prescriptions like, make a poultice of chokeberries and rub it on your neck 3 times a day. He made a real show of it. He used to slip a packet of pills under the table, too, pills that really worked. Anymore, though, he just gave the folk remedy. Jessie hadn't seen any of the pills in a long time. So another suspicious thing, like, why is this doctor not handing out normal medication? "Can I come and help?" Jessie asked Ma. "I don't want you catching anything." Jessie gave her mother what Pa called that pitiful please look, and she relented. "All right, you can carry my bag, but I don't want you coming inside until I find out what Sally and Betsy have." Jessie pulled her dress off the nail by her bed. So again, who keeps their dress on a nail on the wall? And yanked it over her head. Then she scrambled down the ladder and took her boots from beside the door. She was ready by the time Ma finished dressing. Grown women had to worry about clothing more than 13-year-old girls did. That was one reason Jessie was glad she wasn't entirely grown up yet. Ma unlatched the door and they slipped out into the warm April night. "Hannah and the boys never even moved," Jessie said. Ma smiled. "They could sleep through a blizzard. You're my light sleeper. You're always afraid you might miss something." Jessie grinned. It did seem like an adventure being out in the middle of the night. The village looked spooky with only moonlight and the faint glow of Ma's lantern. Shadows flickered on the path and in the surrounding woods. The main buildings of Clifton loomed like hulking animals. Jessie shivered passing the 3 tents in the square that everyone said were haunted. "Did Caleb go on home?" Jessie asked. Caleb Benton was 10, but he was the biggest chicken in Clifton school. I bet he was scared. His Ma didn't want him to wait, Ma said. Jessie waited for Ma to say more, but she didn't. Usually when Jessie convinced Ma to let her go along on these night trips, Ma and Jessie talked all the way, about the symptoms Ma knew and how she planned to treat them, or about Jessie's schoolwork, or about just anything. But tonight, Ma seemed barely aware that Jessie was with her. Ma stepped silently, her face shadowed. Jessie thought Ma might just be tired. This was the 4th night in a row she had been called out. Ma hadn't let Jessie go the other times. They passed the school, the general store, and Dr. Pfister's clapboard house. Jessie couldn't understand how the doctor could afford a clapboard house when no one went to him. Jessie's pa was the blacksmith, and he was always busy, yet Jessie's family still lived in the log cabin they built back in 1828. When they first came to Clifton. So you can hear the hints that were in the 1800s. Jessie had hinted more than once that they needed a new house now that there were 6 children. After all, she said, little Katie was going to outgrow the trundle bed that slipped under Ma and Pa's bed downstairs. Where was Katie going to sleep then? Pa always answered that a new house was too expensive with the whole country in a depression. He didn't seem to mind. Hannah whispered that Pa liked the log cabin too much to build a house. Hannah was just a year older than Jessie, but she said she could remember when they built the log cabin. All the men in the village helped lay the maple logs, one on top of another, and then the women filled the cracks with mud. Jessie had seen other cabins built, had helped even, and thought Hannah might just be confused. Even Hannah couldn't remember when they'd lived in Pennsylvania. Jessie wished she could remember the trip out to Indiana, when she and Hannah and Ma and Pa had arrived down the Ohio River in a flatboat. Sometimes she could get Pa to tell about it. Ma never would. So there's like a weird history to their family. Be careful, Ma said as Jessie tripped over a root in the path. It's hard to see, Jessie said. The moon was behind a cloud now. Ma nodded and moved the lantern closer to Jessie. They were almost to the Bentons' cabin. Do you think Sally and Betsy will be all right? Jessie asked. Sally was prissy, kind of like Hannah, but Betsy was always fun to play with. Prissy just means girly. I hope so, Ma said, in a way that made Jessie worry. A lot of children were sick. Jefferson Webster, Susan Seward, Abby and James Harlow. Jessie knew it wasn't just the normal spring chills and fevers. There were too many empty seats at school. Wait here, Ma said, pointing to a stump in front of the Bentons' cabin. She gave Jessie the lantern and knocked lightly on the door. It opened immediately. Jessie caught a glimpse of Mrs. Benton crying. Mrs. Benton was a tall woman with rough hands. Jessie had never seen her cry. Jessie went to the Bentons' oil paper window, but she could see only shapes moving. The Ma shape seemed to be bent over the bed downstairs. They must have put Sally and Betsy in Mr. and Mrs. Benton's bed. That was serious. The Bentons and Ma talked in such low voices, Jessie couldn't hear anything, and she'd get in trouble if they knew she was trying to listen. She sat down on the stump, placing the lantern on the ground in front of her. She should put it out to save the oil, but it was a comfort. Everyone said bears and wolves stayed away from the fire. All sorts of rustling noises came from the woods behind the Bentons' cabin. Normally, Jessie wasn't scared of wild animals. She was braver than anybody. She took more dangerous dares than the boys at school. But all this sickness and the way Ma was acting worried her. Jessie wished someone would explain what had happened to Dr. Pfister's pills. Even when he'd had them, people pretended they didn't exist, but they always worked. Why weren't there pills for Betsy, Sally, and the others? It was another mystery of Clifton, Jessie thought, like the haunted trees. Once, when Jessie was little, she'd noticed a box at the top of one of the haunted trees. It was painted the same color as the branches, but it held a piece of glass that sometimes glinted in the sunlight. The box moved constantly, even when there wasn't a breeze. Jessie had been so curious that she started climbing the tree. She'd only gotten her right leg up on a branch when Mr. Seward ran out of his store and ordered her down. At first, Jessie thought it was funny to see the big man run, but she didn't laugh long. Mr. Seward spanked her hard, and then Pa spanked her when she got home. Both of them shushed her whenever she tried to say something about the box. After that, the box disappeared and was replaced by a piece of glass in one of the limbs. Jessie never told anyone she saw it, but she would have loved to look at it up close. The thing is, neither Mr. Seward nor Pa had seemed surprised when Jessie told them about the box. Did adults everywhere have so many secrets, or was it just in Clifton? Except when she was a baby, Jessie had never been any farther away from Clifton than a few miles up the hill to pick blackberries. So she had no way of knowing. Only the adults in Clifton seemed to be acting more and more strangely lately. They'd confer in whispers, then pretend nothing was going on. Pa had told Jessie that everyone was worried about the Depression, which started back in 1837 and didn't seem to have an end in sight. Jessie could understand people being worried about that. Pa said even the state had gone bankrupt. But she still suspected the adults were whispering about something else. What could it be? Sometimes Jessie wanted to be an adult right away, so she could learn all the secrets, and sometimes she never wanted to grow up. Jessie giggled, thinking of the fight she'd had just that day with Hannah. Hannah said the only reason to grow up was to get married and have children. Who wants to cook and clean all day? I'm going to be a doctor, Jessie had said. There's no such thing as a woman doctor, Hannah said. I'll be the first then. Hannah laughed at her, so Jessie teased her about being in love with Chester Seward. Was she ever mad about that? It was true, though, and Chester never even looked at Hannah. Jessie had overheard Hannah ask Ma if she would be an old maid if she wasn't married by 16. Like Mr. Seward said, Hannah could be so stupid. Jessie wouldn't care if she never got married. Jessie? Ma was out of the Bentons' door now. Jessie stood and picked up the lantern. Can I help, Ma? We need to go out to the woods to pick up some, herbs. It made no sense. They had every herb imaginable dried and hanging from the rafters at home. But Ma had a strange look on her face that told Jessie not to ask questions. Behind her, Mr. Benton came out and nailed a paper sign to the door. It had one word that Jessie could barely make out in the light. Quarantine. What's a quarantine? Jessie asked. It looked like the kind of word Mr. Smythe, the schoolmaster, would put on the 8th grade spelling list, but Jessie had never seen it. It's a word to let people know that there's a dangerous disease inside, so they should stay away, Ma said. Mr. Benson's going to tell the Websters and the Harlows to put out signs too. Not the C words? Ma shook her head and put her finger to her lips. Another secret. Ma and Jessie walked into the woods in silence. They passed plenty of herbs, but Jessie decided not to ask what they were looking for. Ma was acting too strangely. Finally, they stopped beside a huge rock that Jessie and her friends had played King of the Mountain on before it was forbidden. Ma bent down at the base of the rock. There was nothing but dirt there, but she motioned for Jessie to crouch too. Then, when Jessie had doubled over, her cheek pressed against the cold rock, Ma began to whisper. I may have to ask you to do something very dangerous, Ma said. Jessie felt a chill. What? Ma shook her head impatiently. You can't ask questions now. We may be able to avoid it. The signs may work. 1,000 questions came to Jessie's mind, but she obediently pushed them away. Ma smiled grimly. After school tomorrow, I want you to tell everyone you have to look for more herbs. Don't let anyone come with you. I'll meet you here as soon as it's dark. Why? Jessie couldn't help but ask. I'll tell you then. If I'm not here, everything's fine and you can just go home. But it's important that you do exactly what I say and don't tell anyone. None of it made sense, but Jessie nodded. Then Ma turned away. She picked a few leaves without even looking to see what they were. So a lot of mystery here. And again, it's called Running Out of Time. Here's the cover. And let's see if you can figure out the mystery. See you next time.